Well, China has voiced support for Russia's air campaign against terrorists in Syria, calling for an international anti-terror joint force.
We have always supported anti-terror actions that are in accordance with international law and that have received the consent or authorization from governments of the countries involved. We also call on the international community to form an anti-terror joint force and enhance communication and coordination.
The Foreign Ministry spokeswoman also said Beijing opposes all forms of terrorism and double standards in anti-terror issues. She called on the international community to conduct anti-terrorism cooperation in line with United Nations principles. Meanwhile, Russia's defense ministry says its warplanes have hit some 1,500 targets across Syria over the past week. Syrian opposition sources say a Russian airstrike on the province of Latakia has injured a senior al-Qaeda commander. Russia's been pounding Daesh and other terrorist group positions in Syria since September the 30th. The move, which was welcomed by Iran and Iraq, has drawn criticism from Western governments and some of the regional allies. To get more insight into this story, we're joined from Bristol by Tony Gosling. He's an investigative journalist. Tony, thank you very much for joining us here on Press TV. Well, China has long maintained a policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. Why do you think it's decided to team up with Russia in the battle against ISIL?
Well, look, first of all, let's try and clear up this definition about terrorism. There's lots of different definitions around the world. There are definitions out there, but I think the most popular one is political threats or killings by non-state actors. So if, for example, the Saudi Arabians start bombing in Yemen, as they have been doing, that's not considered terrorism because it's being done by a state. And the reason that this is important is because the states are supposed to be accountable through the United Nations, whereas obviously if they're non-state actors, whether that be ISIS or unfortunately the Kurds too, because they want a homeland, they haven't got a state, although you know, there are a lot of people that think they should, they wouldn't be counted as part of that UN process. But look, I mean, the United Nations is in a bit of a state, isn't it, really? And it has been, I mean, the great ideals when it was set up after World War II, but rather like the League of Nations before it, between World War I and World War II, it's having real problems. International law is in tatters, really, at the moment. But the process started in 1967 with the Six-Day War, the Israelis attacking the Palestinian and occupying Palestinian territories. And although the UN was making resolutions about this, these were constantly vetoed by the United States, and at which point that international law started to break apart. But it's really good to see now that the Chinese are starting to wade in, because they are obviously big players and almost maybe people might say even impartial from the sidelines. They're not directly involved in Syria, whereas the Russians are and the Americans are. So the Chinese can stand back and almost be the peacemakers here. And it sounds to me as if that's what they've been doing, calling for this joint anti-terror force. But there is a really serious problem, and that is that the terrorists that the West calls the opposition on television here, I mean, even though they are armed, I wouldn't really call them an opposition. They're a terrorist force, and they call them the moderate rebels. Now, if there is going to be any agreement about fighting terrorism, a decision has got to be made about, are you going to fight these guys? Who are you going to cooperate with, and who are you going to fight with? So that is going to be a real sticking point. But it's great to see the Chinese wading in here to try and get really bang Russian, should we say, Iranian and American and British heads together to say, let's get together and decide who are the terrorists in Syria, and perhaps then we can allow the state to grow again. I know the Americans don't want that, but that would be, I think, the best outcome, that the Syrian state under Assad can then start running the country again and get rid of the terrorists in its midst.
Well, how do you think China's involvement will actually boost Russia's strategy in countering ISIL? And then why do you think China did not pair up with NATO and the so-called US coalition against ISIL?
Well, you've just heard it from their foreign ministry there, is they are serious about fighting terrorism. And I would bet you that they would include these so-called moderate rebels, the ones that have been trained in Jordan, in Turkey, for example, with Saudi money. Actually, a lot of them buy special forces from the NATO countries. They've been trained by them. The Chinese are counting those people as terrorists, and that they're going to try and put a stop to it. But look, let's be really clear about what's going on in Syria, because this has been brewing for a long time, hasn't it? We've had lots of other countries, including right next door, Iraq, has been destabilized by the Americans. And what we're seeing is a kind of Balkanization of the Middle East, splitting countries up into smaller countries, making it impossible from Assad in Damascus to rule certain parts of Syria. And this suits people like the Israelis, who took the Golan Heights and have illegally occupied that and are now starting to sell oil rights. So we're seeing a Balkanization of Syria, which suits the Israelis very well, because this is exactly what was talked about by Oded Yinon in Israel back in the 1980s, saying they wanted to have all of the Middle East around them balkanized so that Israel could then start to expand. Now, let's not forget, we don't often hear it, but the Israeli Zionists are fundamentalists just as much as people like ISIS. What you would say religious fanatics. So, I think what we're seeing in the West here is a kind of propaganda, really only one side of the view, one side of the coin, and they're not doing their job in representing this in a balanced way. A much, much wider plan that goes back right to the 1980s, and the US and Britain have been involved in this. But we don't see that discussed over here.
An absolute pleasure to talk to you. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us via Skype from Bristol.